The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the roadside into a muddy, glistening stretch of pavement. Streetlights cast dim reflections on the wet ground, their flickering glow barely cutting through the heavy downpour. Cars sped past, their tires splashing through puddles. But no one seemed to notice the lone figure standing motionless by the side of the road. A German shepherd, drenched to the bone, stood with its ears slightly drooped, eyes filled with a quiet desperation. The dog's fur clung to its body, soaked through, making it shiver against the biting cold. Despite the endless stream of vehicles passing by, not a single driver slowed down to take a closer look. The dog did not bark, did not whimper. It only stood there, unwavering, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Its gaze was fixed on the distance, perhaps searching for a familiar face, a kind soul who might recognize its silent plea. The smell of damp earth and gasoline filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of rain. Every now and then, the wind would shift, sending icy droplets against the animal's face. But still, it did not move. It had nowhere to go, no shelter to seek. Hunger gnawed at its stomach, but the pain of abandonment outweighed the ache of an empty belly. A few pedestrians passed by, their umbrellas shielding them from the relentless rain. One woman, wrapped in a thick coat, hesitated for a moment as she spotted the dog. But after a brief glance, she hurried on. Perhaps she had convinced herself that someone else would stop. Or maybe she simply couldn't bear to involve herself in a stray animal's fate. Either way, the shepherd remained alone, water dripping from its fur, standing on unsteady legs. The occasional honk of a car horn startled it, but it did not run. There was nothing left to run from, only memories that could not be escaped. In the distance, headlights appeared, growing brighter as they approached. A battered old pickup truck rumbled down the road, its tires sending up a fine spray of water. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, caught sight of the dog just in time. Unlike the others, he did not look away. His foot eased off the accelerator, and for the first time that evening, the German shepherd had reason to hope. The truck slowed as it pulled onto the shoulder, the engine humming softly. The man watched the dog through the rain-speckled windshield, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had seen many things in his lifetime, too many things. But something about the sight of the lonely shepherd, standing there like a forgotten soul, made his chest tighten. He knew deep down that if he drove away now, the image of the dog would haunt him forever. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold rain. The old man stepped out of his truck, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground as the rain pattered against his worn jacket. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the dog's reaction surprised him. The German shepherd didn't run, didn't even flinch. It simply turned its head slowly, lifting its tired eyes to meet his gaze. For a moment, they just looked at each other, one living being sizing up another, each uncertain of the other's intentions. The man took a cautious step forward, his voice rough from years of smoking and late nights. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, keeping his tone gentle. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The dog didn't answer, of course. It only blinked, rainwater dripping from its fur as his body swayed slightly, as if exhausted from standing too long. The man crouched, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small piece of beef jerky, his dinner, but that hardly mattered now. He tore off a bite-sized piece and held it out on his palm, waiting. The shepherd sniffed the air, its nose twitching. Hunger flickered in its eyes, but there was hesitation too. The man stayed still, letting the dog decide. A minute passed, then another. Finally, with slow, deliberate movements, the shepherd took a step forward, then another. Its wet paws made no sound against the pavement. It stretched its neck forward and almost cautiously took the jerky from his hand. The old man felt the rough scrape of the dog's tongue before it retreated again, chewing the small offering as though savoring every bite. A flicker of something crossed the man's face. Relief? Sadness? Maybe both. "You're not wild," he he said softly, shaking his head. Somebody left you, didn't they? The dog's ears twitched at his words, but it didn't break eye contact. The rain had eased slightly now, turning into a fine mist that hung in the air. The road, once busy, was quieter, the occasional car swishing past in the distance. The man knew he couldn't leave the dog here. Not like this. He let out a heavy sigh, glancing back at his truck. Well, he muttered, standing up with a small grunt. I can't promise much, but I ain't gonna leave you here. He took a step back toward his truck and opened the passenger door. The German Shepherd didn't move. It only watched, ears slightly raised now, uncertainty in his stance. The old man patted the seat, gesturing for the dog to jump in. He didn't try to force it. He just waited. The shepherd looked at him, then at the open door, then back again. For a long moment, it didn't move. But then, as if making a quiet decision, the dog stepped forward, hesitated only slightly, and then, with a small leap, climbed inside. The man smiled, just a little, before shutting the door behind it. As he walked around to the driver's side, he could feel the weight of something shifting, something neither of them fully understood yet. But for the first time in a long while, neither of them was alone. The truck's interior smelled of old leather and damp air, a mix of rain-soaked clothes and worn-out seats. The German Shepherd sat stiffly on the passenger side, its wet fur leaving dark patches on the seat. It didn't move much, only turning its head slightly to glance at the man as he settled behind the wheel. The radio crackled softly, playing an old country song that neither of them really listened to. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the windshield as the wipers cleared the glass with slow, steady sweeps. The old man, whose name was Ray, reached for the heater controls and turned the dial up. Warm air began to flow through the vents, filling the small space with a comforting hum. He noticed the dog's ears twitch at the sound, but it made no attempt to shake off the dampness clinging to its body. Ray sighed and dug into the glove compartment, pulling out an old rag. He reached toward the dog, hesitating for a second, before gently patting its head with the cloth. "There you go, buddy," he murmured, rubbing the rag over the shepherd's ears and neck. The dog flinched slightly at first, but didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a deep sigh, a sound of exhaustion rather than fear. Ray continued drying it off as best he could, shaking his head. "Somebody really did a number on you, huh?" The shepherd didn't respond, of course, but there was something in its eyes, a quiet understanding, a tired acceptance. It wasn't just a stray. It had belonged to someone once, someone who had abandoned it, left it out in the cold like an unwanted thing. Ray had seen this before, too many times. People took in dogs when they were cute and playful, but when things got tough, they tossed them aside like old furniture. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the frustration welling up in his chest. The truck rumbled forward as he pulled onto the road, heading toward the outskirts of town. His house wasn't much, just a small place on a patch of land, quiet and tucked away from the world. It was more of a workshop than a home, cluttered with old tools and unfinished projects. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with the dog yet. Maybe just give it a warm place for the night, some food, a dry spot to rest. But as he glanced over at the shepherd, curled slightly on the seat, eyes half closed, he had a feeling this wasn't going to be just for one night. The road stretched out ahead, dark and wet, the streetlights glowing faintly in the misty air. Ray gripped the wheel a little tighter. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. That dog wasn't going back to the roadside ever again. The truck rattled down the narrow road leading to Ray's home, the rain now reduced to a fine mist that clung to the windshield. The headlights cast long shadows over the gravel driveway, illuminating the small weathered cabin that stood alone in the quiet countryside. It wasn't much, just a single-story house with a sagging porch and a workshop to the side, but it was home. Ray cut the engine and glanced at the German Shepherd. The dog remained still, its body curled slightly on the seat, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "Well, buddy," Ray muttered, pushing open his door. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere." The shepherd lifted its head slightly, ears twitching as Ray stepped out and slammed the truck door shut. The sound echoed in the silence. For a moment, the dog remained motionless, staring at the open space outside, uncertain. Ray walked around and opened the passenger door, stepping back to give the dog room. "Come on," he said, patting his leg. "Let's get you inside." The shepherd hesitated. Then, with a slow and cautious movement, it leaped down from the truck. Its paws landed lightly on the wet gravel, and it stood still, taking in its surroundings. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and the faint scent of old motor oil from Ray's workshop. There were no fences, no leashes, just open space and the quiet hum of the night. The dog's eyes darted to Ray, as if waiting for his next move.
Ray walked up to the porch and pushed the door open. A dim light flickered inside, casting a warm glow over the small living room. It was cluttered but cozy. A worn-out recliner sat in one corner. A wood-burning stove crackled in the other. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, tools, and little trinkets Ray had collected over the years. He turned back to the dog, who stood at the threshold, sniffing the air. "Ain't fancy," Ray admitted, scratching the back of his head, "but it beats the roadside." The shepherd took a hesitant step inside, its nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. It moved slowly, cautiously, as if expecting someone to chase it out. Ray watched as the dog sniffed around, taking in the unfamiliar scents. Then, finally, with a deep exhale, it settled near the stove, curling up on the rug without a sound. Ray stood there for a moment, arms crossed, watching the dog as it let out a heavy sigh, its body relaxing for the first time. He knew this wasn't just about giving a stray dog shelter for a night. There was something in those tired eyes, something that told him this dog had been through more than it deserved. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt responsible now. He grabbed an old blanket from the couch and walked over, gently draping it over the shepherd's back. The dog didn't flinch. It only blinked up at him, then closed its eyes. "Guess that means you're staying," Ray muttered, shaking his head with a small smirk. The dog didn't answer, but it didn't have to. For the first time in what must have been a long while, it was home. The night passed quietly, except for the occasional crackle of the wood-burning stove. The German shepherd slept soundly on the rug, barely stirring even when the wind rattled the windows. Ray had settled into his old recliner, a blanket draped over his legs, but sleep didn't come easy. His mind wandered back to the dog, wondering where it had come from and what kind of life it had before ending up on that cold, rain-soaked roadside. By morning, the sky had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, golden dawn. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the wooden floor. Ray stretched, his joints popping in protest as he got up from his chair. He glanced at the dog, half expecting it to be gone, but there it was, still curled up near the stove, its breathing slow and steady. Ray stepped into the kitchen and started his morning routine, brewing coffee, frying up some eggs. The smell filled the small house, warm and familiar. As he poured himself a cup, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw the shepherd standing in the doorway, watching him with quiet curiosity. It was the first time the dog had approached him voluntarily. "Well, look who's up," Ray said, leaning against the counter. The dog didn't move closer, but its ears perked slightly at his voice. He grabbed a plate and scooped some scrambled eggs onto it, then placed it on the floor a few feet away. The shepherd eyed it warily but made no move. "Go on," Ray encouraged. "Ain't poison." After a long pause, the dog took a cautious step forward, sniffing the plate before finally lowering its head to eat. It wasn't desperate or frantic, just controlled, measured, like an animal used to rationing its food. Ray watched in silence, sipping his coffee. This wasn't just hunger. This was survival. When the dog finished, it licked its lips and looked up at Ray, as if expecting him to take the plate away. Instead, Ray simply nodded. "Not bad, huh?" he said. The shepherd blinked. Then, for the first time, it wagged its tail. Just once, barely noticeable, but it was there, a small, hesitant sign of trust. Ray smirked, setting his coffee down. "All right, buddy, he said. "I guess we ought to figure out what to call you." He leaned against the counter, studying the dog. It had the strong, noble build of a true working shepherd, but there was something else in its eyes, something worn, something tired. "How about Duke?" he suggested. "You look like a Duke to me." The dog didn't react at first, but after a second, it lifted its head slightly, ears twitching. Ray chuckled. "Duke it is, then." He reached out slowly, palm up, giving the dog a choice. Duke hesitated, then, after a moment's thought, he lowered his head and pressed his nose against Ray's fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Trust had to start somewhere. Days turned into weeks, and Duke slowly began to settle into his new life with Ray. At first, he remained cautious, always keeping a careful distance, as if expecting to be thrown out at any moment. But as the days passed, the tension in his body eased. He started following Ray around the house, watching him work in the garage, resting near his feet when he read by the fire. The fear in his eyes faded, replaced by something softer, something like trust. Ray never forced anything. He let Duke come to him on his own terms. He learned to read the dog's moods, the way his ears twitched when he was uncertain, the slight wag of his tail when he was content. The first time Duke nudged Ray's hand for attention, it caught him off guard, but he smiled, running his fingers through the thick fur on the dog's neck. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Duke sighed, pressing into the touch. One afternoon, as Ray worked on his old pickup outside, Duke lay nearby, basking in the weak winter sun. It was one of those rare quiet days where everything felt still, almost peaceful. But then, in the distance, a car rumbled down the gravel road, kicking up dust. Duke's head snapped up instantly. His body stiffened, his ears pointed forward, his muscles tense. Ray wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at Duke. "Easy, boy," he said. But something was different. Duke wasn't just alert, he looked afraid. The car, an old rusted sedan, slowed as it approached the property. Ray frowned, stepping forward as the driver rolled down the window. A man in his late 40s, rough-looking, with sunburnt skin and a cigarette dangling from his lips, peered out. "That your dog?" the man asked, nodding toward Duke. Ray didn't like the way he said it. He glanced at Duke, who stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the man. Something in his body language, rigid, silent, uneasy, made Ray's gut twist. "Why do you ask?" Ray said carefully. The man smirked. "Had a shepherd like that once. Ran off a while back. Thought maybe he found his way here." Ray glanced at Duke again. The dog hadn't moved, but his tail was tucked low, his paws planted firmly on the ground like he was bracing for something. Ray had seen that kind of fear before, not just worry, but deep, learned fear. His jaw tightened. "Never seen him before in my life," Ray lied smoothly. The man narrowed his eyes, scanning Duke for a long moment, but then he shrugged. "Well," he muttered, tossing his cigarette out the window. "Guess it ain't him." Without another word, he shifted the car into gear and pulled away, kicking up more dust as he sped off. Ray waited until the car disappeared down the road before turning back to Duke. The dog's whole body trembled, his ears flattened against his head. Ray crouched beside him, resting a hand gently on his side. "It's all right," he murmured. "He's gone." Duke slowly turned his head, looking up at Ray with those deep, knowing eyes. And for the first time, Ray understood. Duke hadn't just been a stray. He had been running from something, from someone. Ray exhaled, rubbing the dog's head. "You're safe here," he said softly. Duke hesitated for a moment, then leaned into Ray's touch, pressing his forehead against the man's chest. Ray wrapped an arm around him, a silent promise passing between them. No matter where Duke had come from, no matter what he had been through, he wasn't alone anymore, and he never would be again. The end. This story reminds us that trust isn't given freely, it's earned, that kindness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones forged in silence, in patience, and in understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Every animal deserves a second chance, just like Duke. If you've ever helped an animal in your life, subscribe to this channel in their name, not for me, not for you, but for them, the ones who have always given love without asking for anything in return.